Okay, so I wanted to talk tonight about, we could call it the proper demeanor of a Rav, maybe required arrogance, or the arrogance of the rabbinate. Now, I'll tell you what I mean by that. I want to start with the story. There's a shtickle well-known story about Reb Shimon Sefer, the Chassam Sefer's son. Now, the Chassam Sefer was married twice. His first wife was nifter when he was in his 40s. They had no children together. And then the Chassam Sefer got married again to Reb Kiveger's daughter. And him and his new wife, Reb Kiveger's daughter, had many children. I don't remember exactly, 12, 13, many children. The Chassam Sefer got married for the second time when he was almost 50 years old. And he was nifter at 77. So he left behind a whole cadre of young children, qualified children, but young children. His oldest son succeeded him as the Rav in Pressburg and became the Rav in his stead. One of his other children, the Simon Sefer, goes on to become the Rav of Krakow. Now, the Sefer family lived in Pressburg, which is in, borderline Austrian area, Oberlander. And it was always like a milsa de tmiya how Reb Shimon Sefer ended up being the Rav in Krakow, in the middle of Poland. Now, there's a story that's told about how he acquired that stellar that I think is germane to our discussion and is interesting. Supposedly, Reb Shimon Sefer was once traveling, and he ended up in Krakow. Now, being there to spend the night, he inquired as to who the Rav of Krakow was, and he said he would love to go see whoever the Rav is and pay his respects. Upon requesting this, he was told, there is no Rav of Krakow. Krakow doesn't have a Rav. So he inquired as to why. And they explained to him that Krakow has upper crust, an elite of Talmidei Chachamim, of Laimdim, of rich people, and anyone who tries to, probably for the job, gets shot down. These people sit in the front rows of the shul and they shoot him down. There's no way to get through this gauntlet of questioners and interference. Shimon Sefer was troubled by this, and he felt this was inappropriate. He says, you know what, I would love to take a prub over here. I want to go for it. I want to try. His host was incredulous. I'm saying, what could you possibly want to do over here? You know that this is an impossible job to win. He says, no, I want to. Okay, they work it out, they arrange it, and the Shimon Sefer gets up to speak. Before he says his shtickle Torah for the prub, before he gives his dissertation, he stands up and he says, Rabbi say, I want to tell you a story. He says, when I was a child in Pressburg, there was a sheikhet who was not doing what he was supposed to. He was being machshel people with levels of kashrus that was unacceptable to my father, the Chassam Sefer. And my father sent me as a messenger. He said, please, Shimon, go to the sheikhet and warn him, tell him that I need to talk to him. I went to the sheikhet, who was a big, scruffy man, 6 feet tall, with big butcher hands. He grabbed me by my shirt and he threw me out. He said, if you come back here again, I'll kill you. I ran home to my father, a terrified young child, and my father said, Shimon, I need you to go back again. Tell him he has to come back again. But I refused. I said, I'm not going back. He's going to kill me. So to mollify me, my father told me, I'm going to tell you a name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and should you feel in danger from this man, say this shame and it will resolve itself. So Shimon Sefer says, I went back to this butcher, and as expected, he grabbed me by my neck, he picked me up, he put me against the wall, and he begins to squeeze the life out of me. Feeling under threat, I blurt out this name that my father had told me, and instantly this sheikhet, this big burly man, collapses to the floor. So Shimon Sefer looks around the room in Krakow, this big shul in the center of Krakow, and he says, Rabbi Say, if you seek to interrupt me and to question me because you have a genuine question until Shem Shemayim, ask away. But if what you're trying to do is undermine the rabbinate because, for your own glory and your own kavod, then I will caution you that I still remember that shame that my father told me. And legend has it that it was a silence reigned in the room for the entire time that Shimon Sefer spoke. And obviously duly impressed by his knowledge, he was hired and he became the Rav of Krakow. And I think his children and his Einiklach continued to be the Rabbanim of Krakow. And that's the story how I ended up there. Now, what's interesting is that Shimon Sefer displays a certain forthrightness, like a certain, trust in himself, confidence in himself and his abilities and in his need to be here, that allows him to almost like to act out threatening to these people and thereby, securing this stellar. Now, I guess what I want to discuss is this type of, call it gaiva or confidence that a Rav is required to have, or that a person in leadership is required to have, that Rav Shimon Sefer displayed, that made him marked for greatness and so suitable and credible for this job. Now, there's a way to discuss this from a hashkafa musari perspective, and there's a way to discuss this from a more halachic perspective. I want to start with the hashkafa musari perspective, and then if we have time, we'll get to the more halachic perspective. Now, the Gemara in Saita and Daf Hey spends Kamata Black Gemara describing for us in great detail the gnus of gaiva, how terrible it is to be about gaiva, how frowned upon it is, how little HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to do with you, v'chula v'chula. The Gemara brings many drashas, many rayas, many makairis, that being arrogant is considered to be a tremendous character flaw, maybe from the greatest character flaws that a person could have. Now, what's strange is that the Gemara brings, after that, the Gemara brings as follows. It says, Amar of Chia Barashi Amarav, Talmud Chacham tzarech sheyeh b'yachad mishmeina b'shminas. A Talmud Chacham has to have an eighth of an eighth, which is 1/64th of gaiva in him, a small amount of gaiva the Talmud Chacham has to possess. Now, the Gemara brings another other deis on this, and I'll just read through the whole Gemara just so we have all the opinions before we discuss the underlying issue over here. The Gemara brings Amar of Huna Breda Rishua, it's nice for him like the fuzz on top of a stalk, meaning it's appropriate and right for a Talmud Chacham to have this small measure of gaiva inside of him. Amar Rava says, B'shamta the ispe, b'shamta the lespe. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Meaning you have to have a certain amount. You can't have too much or too little. You have to have a little bit of gaiva. Talmud Chacham has to have. Now the Gemara brings a chaylik, and the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Loi minei v'loi miktsasei. You don't want to have anything to do with gaiva, not with it or anything to do with it. Meaning you want to be kept away from gaiva to the furthest extent. Like how you talking that we should mana Talmud Chacham to have anything to do with gaiva? Is it small to us this that it says, Tayavas Hashem Kol Gvalev? We want to stay away from gaiva at all costs. Now, the Gemara over here is, and I got it, the Gemara, but the Rambam in Hilchos Deis in Perek Beis Halacha Gimel, the Rambam paskins like the second day in the Gemara. The Rambam says that Yesh Deis She'asal Le'la Adam Linig Behem Bebeininus. There are certain midas rayas, certain deis that are so puzzle, that are so treif, that a person has to stay away from them, even operating from them, in a beininistic way, in a middle of the road type of way. El yisrachik min hakatza echad al hakatza echad. You have to mamish go to the end of the road, stay as far away from them as possible, and one of those is who gave alev, arrogance. She'ein derech hatay v'shei adam ana bilvad, ha shei shval ruach v'tei ruch in a muchal amoyed. The Ram says it's not enough just to be humble. A person has to be act with the most humility and the most humbleness that is possible. He should be mamish a shval lev. The Rambam brings va'id amru Chazal say b'shamtem an deis begas zeruach afil miktsasa. Someone who even has a little bit of gaiva in him is b'shamtem. Now you see, the Rambam is clearly learning the Gemara that the last 2 days, Sayyid Mount Amru says b'shamtem dispe, b'shamtem lespe, and of course Mount Amru says lemi nevi lemi miktsasa, mean to be arguing on the Mount Amru that says that Talmud Chacham has to have a shminish of a shminis, an eighth of an eighth, and they're disputing it, and the Rambam says halacha kemaisam, that gaiva is such a midah, such a terrible tchuna, such a bad look, that a person has to stay away from it in Gansan, and even a Talmud Chacham has to stay away from it. Now that's the Rambam's day. Now, the other Rishayim and even the Netzei Kalim and the Rambam, the Lechem Mishnah and the Kesef Mishnah, and the Sefer Eirich Meisharim, the Adam Melech, a lot of the Achrayim ask, and the Rambam, some ask that it's a steer in the Rambam himself in Perek Gimel and Perek Aleph in Hilchos Deis. He uses gaiva as an example of something that can be corrected but is okay in moderation. So it's a steer in the Rambam. Others ask that the Gemara, the way the structure of the Gemara is built, implies that the Gemara was saying we don't pass on like the second man damar, we apply like the first man damar. But be it as it may, however we talk through the Rambam to explain it, the Rambam seemingly seems to hold like the man damar that says Lemin Evil Lemin Tzasei, gaiva is so terrible, one needs to distance himself from it to the highest level and stay away from it at all costs. Now Lamaisa, the other Rishayim and the Pashas of the Gemara say this idea that for a Talmud Chacham it's permitted to have a gaiva shminish of a shminis. Now, there is, call it many different mahalchim in the Achrayim, so to speak, to be madche what this allowable amount of gaiva is. Meaning, because it is interesting that the Gemara says this interesting sprach of shminish of a shminis. If the Gemara wanted to say that it's permitted or desirable for a Talmud Chacham to have a small amount of gaiva, the Gemara could have just said, Talmud Chacham tzarich shetiyah lo, k'tzas gaiva, miktzas gaiva, a little bit. How come the Gemara used this, interesting sprach of Shmina Shebeshminis, an eighth of an eighth? It's like an interesting, unique sprach. Now, many Achronim, the Marsha, the Maratz Chayes, the Yavitz, the Maral, the Rebbeinu and Eibshitz, each one of them has in his own way to explain exactly, what this specific type of gaiva that we're talking about. Lamashal, the Marsha says that the psukim in Kufyatas and Tehillim, which are describing the milas of the Torah, are all done in eighths, instead of eighths, and the 8 psukim, I'll say they're alphabets. So it's kilu being muramez that the koyach HaTorah, the chshivas HaTorah is so much that in order to protect the Torah, the Talmud Chacham has to have some sort of gaiva. Others say, there's a lot of different versions in the Achronim. There's one that's an interesting one that I'll share. I don't want to go into. I saw once, I think, a list of like 15 mahalchim and how to learn Shmini Shebeshminis. Some being mocked in it more than others, some pushing it away further than others, some saying it in a more straightforward sense, but everybody trying to diminish or to learn some sort of lesson from Chazal's, exhortation that a Talmud Chacham should have some sort of gaiva, that it doesn't mean it at face value. But there's an interesting shot that the Chaim Falaji in his Sefer Einik El Chai writes that the guy mirrors in a certain sense that I want to share. He says the Shmini Shebeshminis, he says, referring to the 8th pasuk in the 8th parsha of the Torah. The 8th pasuk in the 8th parsha of the Torah is Parshas Vayishlach, is the pasuk that Yaakov Avinu says after he's saved. Yaakov Avinu says, "Katanti mikol hachasadim mikol ha'emes." I've become small from all the chesed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for me. Ki b'makli avarti es hayarden v'atah yizi l'shtei machnes. Because I crossed the Yarden with just my stick in my hand, and we know the Medrash that Eliphaz chased Yaakov Avinu and took away all his possessions, and therefore rendering Yaakov chashav kameis, and dispensing from himself the obligation that his father Esav instructed him to kill Yaakov Avinu. So Yaakov Avinu was bare and alone, and he says now when he's returning back, from Lavan, he says, I've blossomed and flourished into a tribe, that can be split into two groups to be saved from Esav and Lavan and etc. So the Kaf HaChaim is implying that the gaiva that's being discussed over here is really like a counterintuitive. It's a remes v'anava. It means to say even a tzaddik who's flourishing and who's being successful should always remember katanti mikol chasadim. Like I owe HaKadosh Baruch Hu everything. So essentially it's weiter, exhorting a Talmud Chacham to be humble. Now the Goyin in Koil Leo, he says this like in a little different way. He points out that there's an interesting thing. He points out that the Gemara in Brachas and Daf Yudam Beis says that when a person is being mevakish rachamim for himself, he should be toile b'schus acherim. It's arrogant to ask for yourself, like b'schus atzmi give me. You're supposed to ask in the schus of my father, my grandfather, the schus of his. You're supposed to ask in the schus of others that you should be saved. But the Gemara says that once you're nitzel, when you are saved, you should be toile b'schus atzmcha. You should be toile in yourself. Now, what is this paradigm shift? What happens over here? So the guy is masber, and this is really minei in the Gemara, that when you're asking to be saved, if you ask b'schus atzmcha, that implies that you think that you're worthy. That's a certain lack of humility. You ask b'schus acherim, which says, I myself am not worthy of being saved. I myself am nothing. I'm asking b'schus others that I should be saved. But when you are saved, if you say, I was saved because of myself, I was saved because of my schusim, so that puts you on your best behavior. Then you become like Yaakov Avinu, I'm bare and bereft. I have nothing left. I used everything. I spent all my schusim to get saved. A person who, when he needs to be saved, asks for a b'schus acherim, and when he is saved, says, I must have used up everything I have. That's a humble person, b'shleimus. That's a humble person from beginning to end. As he asks, he's humble. When he receives, he's humble. Says the Goyin, that's the Shmini Shebeshminis. Meaning the Gemara that's referring to over here, Talmud Chacham, is mechuyev to have a Shmini Shebeshminis. It means a tremendous level of humility and self-awareness that the Talmud Chacham should display, that's being required of him. So in any event, Yech Shiyeh, the Gemara is described in many ways, and the Achreinim, each one b'signon shelahem, is trying to describe what exactly this gaiva and how it really doesn't mean at face value so much gaiva, etc., etc. But kipshutei, ein mikra yetim de pshutei, vein chazal yetim de pshutei. That's as I said the Marsha in Baba Basra and Samachei. Chazal has to have its front meaning still has to remain. So the Gemara is manning of a Talmud Chacham shiyeh b'shminish b'shminis, and Rashi learns the Gemara straight down the line. Rashi teaches Echel Mishminish B'Shminis 1/8 of an eighth. Rashi says Mishkol Katanu. It's a small amount. Granted, it's not a grace amount. V'hainu Ochla Kalem Etzarach Sheyehei Ma'at Gaiva. He has to have a little bit of gaiva. Why? Says Rashi reason. Here Rashi advances rationale for this that ties this all together. Rashi says, Shaloye Kali Harosh Mistoilin Boy. So that the lightheaded and the lighthearted, around him shouldn't just run all over him. He should be in a position to force them to accept his words, to dictate from the top down, and therefore be a successful, Rav, Rosh Hashiva, whatever it is, Paisik that he's doing, whatever rabbinic track he's taking. He should be able to be dictating and to be taken seriously, and therefore he has to have this gaiva. So now Rashi kind of explains to us that what this Gemara is demanding is this Rav Shimon Seiferdike demeanor of someone in rabbinics, a certain required backbone or arrogance or confidence that's required of him in order to be able to withstand the challenges and to withstand the tests and be able to accomplish what he needs to accomplish. Now, along this vein, additionally, there's the Gemara in Yuma, in Daf Chav Beis, when it discusses Shaul HaMelech, it says, Kama Chaldi v'lemar gesheni d'mar Saye, and it says why? Because Shaul be'achas v'alsalei, Shaul did one Aveira, where he disobeyed HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he lost his kingship. David b'shtayim v'lei alsalei, David sinned, so to speak, more egregiously or more prevalently than Shaul HaMelech, and he was allowed to keep his kingdom. Now, so the Gemara says this as a raya that if a person has siyata d'shmaya, he's going to be safe. L'maisa, what's taka the pshat? Why was Shaul HaMelech's kaviyachol, Shaul's Aveira, meaning when we talk about these Aveiras, you have to keep in mind these are not Aveiras like we think, but why was Shaul HaMelech's Aveira, so to speak, so detrimental that he had to lose his kingdom? And David HaMelech's Aveiras, even though they were more numerous in number, and seemingly, if we would look at them, would be more chamor than what Shaul HaMelech was ever on, they somehow didn't cost David HaMelech his kingdom. Now, the Einig Yom Tov, I believe in the Hakdamat Sefer, he explains, and I've heard this from my father always says over this Einig Yom Tov, that Shaul HaMelech's Aveiros, if you look at the Psukim, it's as follows. Shaul HaMelech was mitzvah by Shmuel HaNavi to go and kill out Agag, the king of the Amalekim, and to kill all their animals, everybody. Now, what happens? Shaul kills all the warriors, he kills almost everybody, but he leaves over the women and the children. I take it back. No, he leaves over Agag, the king, who he's going to kill the next day. And the tzibur tells him, the animals are wonderful animals. These are fat, very beautiful animals. Let's take them and we'll bring korbanos from these animals. And Shaul HaMelech is taken in by that argument, and he says, you know what, I agree. And I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to let the animals survive so we can bring them as korbanos. Now, ultimately, Agag is able to repopulate, and Shaul HaMelech fails at his job of destroying Amalek. And we know, in Kisei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shlema, calls man that Amalek is around, and it's a terrible thing for Klal Yisrael. Now, when Shmuel confronts David HaMelech, he says, Yan Hashem ma'asta b'dvar Hashem. You were moyes in the Dvar Hashem. You didn't listen to the Dvar Hashem. He says, why? Because you lit. So what does Shaul HaMelech's response? Shaul HaMelech's response is, no, the people told me that we should save these animals, and I listened to them. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu tell Shmuel to tell Shaul, then you're losing your kingdom. Says then Yom Tov, I'll explain to you why. He says, Shaul HaMelech wasn't able to say, I made this decision, I thought this would be the right thing. Shaul HaMelech says, the people wanted and I acquiesced. I acquiesce to the people. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's a failure in leadership. That's not someone who's royal l'malchus. That achas, that one aveira, that one misstep is so definitive of your ability to be a king that he had to lose the stellar. As opposed to David HaMelech, even though b'shtayim, he sinned, so to speak, Kaviyachal, in more ways than Shaul HaMelech, but they weren't aveiros that lacked leadership, that lacked his ability to lead the people. So that wasn't as consequential to his ability to be king. Once again, this just highlights the necessary backbone and gvurashaft and gaiva that's required of someone in leadership to not bend and buckle to the pressures of the people around him. Now, I once saw a letter from Rav Hutner that I think drives home this point. Rav Hutner, in a letter, he's writing to Kehila that's celebrating the 25th anniversary of their Rav being there, and he writes to them that your Kehila has it very right in regards to how a Rav should be. And he explains it with a mashal. He says, in every town in Europe, in every old town, there was a clock tower. In the center of the town, there'd be a clock, high up on a tower that everybody could see the time on. He says, now a clock tower was always tall. You'd put it taller than everything, and you put a clock on top of it. He says, now there are two reasons why a clock tower had to be tall. He says, reason number one is because it has to be high enough for everybody to see from it. You have to be able to see the time on it, and from wherever you are in town, you should be able to see the time on the clock. He says, the reason number two is that if a clock tower would be low enough for people to tamper it, people to touch it, and people would pass by, they're late to a meeting, they look at their watch, they see they're late to a meeting, but they see the clock tower is not exactly like their watch. They adjust the clock tower to be like their watch. Now they're on time, no problem. And he says a clock tower that's too low is open to being adjusted by every random passerby who wants the clock to match his time. So he says it's the same with someone with a Rav. He writes a Rav has to be high enough, removed enough, elevated enough that everybody from the whole town could look at him and see, elevatedness and see what they need to see and see how to follow and to grow from him. But he says additionally, the Rav is like the clock tower. He has to be elevated and lifted up so that he can't be adjusted by everybody who wants to. Not every person who passes by could adjust the clock tower, the Rav, to his whims. Meaning it's important that the Rav should be speaking his thoughts in his voice and not the people's thoughts in his voice, so that he could lead and he's not just, following while he's leading. Similar to the lesson of Shalom Melech and to the lesson of what Rashi is taking out of this Gemara in Saita. Now, there's another interesting story that I once came across that's I'll share on this Indian is the Levushei Srad. When he got his first stellar, he was a young man, and there was someone in the Kehillah, an older person, a Talmid Chacham, who was misnaged to Levushei Srad getting the stellar for whatever reason. And the Levushei Srad was aware of this isnagdus. He was a man who made his opinions known, and it was problematic because he was a wealthy, powerful person in the town. He was opposing Levushei Srad's candidacy. Now, literally a month into the job, Levushei Srad, the younger man, comes to Levushei Srad and he tells him that a business deal that I was doing with this chashuv person in town went awry, and now we have a din Torah, and I need you to adjudicate this din Torah. Levushei Srad says, sure, send a message to this businessman, to this senior businessman in town, that the Rav requests him to come to the din Torah, to the Beis Din Shtib, so he could down this din Torah. So this Gvir, Talmid Chacham, older person in town, sends a message to Levushei Srad that I'm not coming, you're not ready to dan me. Levushei Srad sends him a second message, you have to. This person replies, whatever you know, I know, and if I didn't think this was richtig al pi halach, I wouldn't have done it, so there's nothing to talk about. Now Levushei Srad, after 2 warnings, sends him a message, a harshly worded message, and he says as follows: if you're not going to submit to the din Torah that I'm inviting you to, that I'm demanding you attend, I'm gonna put you in chayrim and be roidif you with all the tools of the trade to force you to listen. And now the Gvir says, fine, I'll come. Now Levushei Srad prepares himself, mentally prepares himself. He figures he's going to have to face down this Gvir who's going to show up to his house, angry but humbled. And to his shock and surprise, the Gvir walks right up to Levushei Srad and plants a kiss on his head. And he said, Herzachain, I was worried about you, you're a young man. I wasn't sure if you were going to have what it takes to lead and to do what you're supposed to in town over here now. And I was worried and I had some sort of misnagdus. But Baruch Hashem, I see that you have what it takes. You're cut out from the right stuff, and I'm your Talmud now for from here on in. And I'm happy to shtaltzu and to participate as needed. So he was, so to speak, demanding of the young Levushei Srad, of this young Rav of his town, let me see that you have the gaiva necessary, meaning not just the Talmid Chacham Shaf, not just the Satira, not just the Ernstkeit. Let me see that you have the backbone, the gaiva, the strength of character that's necessary to sometimes stand up to the strong and the powerful and the rich and the successful, and to help everybody, how you're supposed to. This is just a story that Mamish highlights this Nakuda. Now, we're running out of time here, but I'll just talk for a minute briefly about the more halachic aspect of this din. Now, the more halachic aspect of this character profile that we're discussing is really Mefurish Pasuk. The Pasuk in Parshas Devarim says, when it talks about being a dayan, it says Sakiru panim b'mishpat, kakatan kagadol tishmun, and then it says there's a special isser like Saguru mipnei yesh. You shouldn't be afraid of any person. Why? Ki hamishpat lalikimhu adavar sheyikshimichem takriven elay v'shemativ. Now the Gemara in Sanhedrin learns from this din of Saguru mipnei yesh that a Talmud who's sitting in front of his Rebbe could interject if he sees a schos. A dayan's not allowed to listen to one versus the other. A rich person and a poor person both have to be treated equally. The Gemara learns various dinim from this mitzvah le'sigurim pnei yesh, and this is a din in Shulchan Aruch. I mean, it's a din in Cheshem Mishpat and some Yud Beis, I think. The Rambam paskins like this. There's a din le'sigurim pnei yesh that a Rav has to have a dayan has to have the strength to stand up to anybody, no matter how fearful he is of that person. Now, what's interesting about this, and this I'll close with this, I'm not going to have time to go into this in detail, What's interesting is that this din of Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish has a very unique feature. We know the halacha in Kol Torah Kula is that Gimel Averis Chamuris are Harg La Yaver. For 3 Averis Chamuris, you have to be Harg La Yaver. But anything else, any other Aver in the world, Imaymr L'cha, that you should be over it and not get killed, you have to be over it and not get killed. Now, the din, the mitzvah, the chiyuv of Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish seemingly might be like an exception to this rule. There's a Sifri in Devarim that's quoted by some of the Paiskim. I think Rabbi Yochanan in Shar Tshuva even brings it down. That says, Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish, you shouldn't be afraid of anybody. Shema Taimar, says the Sifri, Misyara ani mipnei ish, plaini, Shema Yaharig es bani. I have to be afraid of this strong person. He might kill my son. Or Shema Yadlik es Gedishi. He might light my assets on fire. Or Shema Yakatzis es Tiyosei. He'll cut down my crops. Talmud Lemer Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish, don't be afraid of anybody. So now the Sifri seems to be saying, even if you're afraid that this person will kill you or your family, meaning a real mobster, a real mafioso, still the din of Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish is mechayiv you to not be afraid of him. Well, that's a tremendous milsa the tema. Like it's an algemeine rule in Kol Torah Kula that Pikuach Nefesh is deicha everything. Why would it be that in this din of Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish you can't be afraid of anybody, even Pikuach Nefesh shouldn't be deicha? Now there's I'm running out of time. I'm not going to have time to discuss this, but there's achronim that say it doesn't really mean it. It means hyperbolic. Even if he's just threatening you, shouldn't be afraid. Some of the achronim, some Zalman and Tzitliyezer have chuvas about it, where they say it just means that later on, of course you bend to his will because you're not mechayiv to be killed. But later on you have to make a public stink and be mefarsim that this person forced you. There are the others that say it's tali in the Yam Shashlema with Sila Fatera. You're not allowed to lie about a din. Rav Moshe has a tshuva about it, but there's way too much to get to on this topic. Where it's relevant, as I saw Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein in the tshuva, has about a Magid Shir who is giving shir to new Bali tshuva, and they're getting to a sugya where it could be slightly hurtful if he tells them the truth, like what the din in the sugya is. And he has this whole shaila, is the Magid Shir mechuyev to keep going straight and tell them this din or this lekach, even if it's going to be, hurtful to them and they might have pushback? Or is he allowed to, hide this din and then get back to it later? And it's relevant to how the different ways if you learn the Sigurim Pnei Ish. But upon him, Hanagel in Yanenu, is that this temperament that's required of a Rav or a Dayan is something that's in Hilchas Musar, like in Hilchas Gaiva you're mechuyev to have, and B is something that in Hilchas Dayanis in Shulchan Aruch there's a din of Le'Sigurim Pnei Ish, you're mechuyev to have this type of backbone, this type of gvura that's relevant. And this is just a little discussion of that story of Reb Shimon Sefer, in a bit of a fuller context.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.